It was the summer before my senior year of high school when everything changed. I had grown up in a small town called Riverview, situated along the banks of the Hudson River. My parents, Mark and Sarah, were both teachers at the local elementary school, and I was an only child. We had a cozy little home on Oak Street, just a few blocks from the river's edge. From an early age, I had always felt a deep connection to nature and the great outdoors. Spending time by the river, hiking in the nearby woods, or simply sitting in our backyard garden brought me a sense of peace and tranquility that few other things could match. Perhaps it was this affinity that led me to develop a passion for environmental science and conservation. As I prepared for my final year of high school, I had already decided that I wanted to pursue a degree in environmental studies after graduation. My dream was to one day work for a national park or a prominent conservation organization, helping to protect and preserve the natural wonders of our world. Little did I know, however, that a chance encounter that summer would not only challenge my plans for the future, but would also force me to confront some harsh realities about the world we live in. It was a sweltering August afternoon when I decided to take a break from studying and go for a hike along the river trail. As I made my way through the familiar path, weaving between towering oak trees and clusters of wildflowers, I couldn't help but feel a sense of serenity wash over me. That's when I stumbled upon a sight that would forever change my perspective. Just off the beaten path, I noticed a heap of trash and debris, carelessly discarded in the midst of this otherwise pristine natural setting. Plastic bottles, fast food wrappers, and other non-biodegradable waste littered the area, a stark contrast to the beauty that surrounded it. As I moved closer to investigate, I noticed a small creek trickling nearby, its once clear waters now muddied and polluted by the runoff from the trash pile. It was then that I saw them, a family of ducks, huddled together in the tainted stream, their feathers matted and their movements sluggish. Anger and sadness welled up inside me as I realized the devastating impact that human negligence and disregard for the environment could have on innocent creatures. In that moment, my passion for environmental conservation took on a new sense of urgency. I knew I couldn't simply stand by and watch as our natural world was slowly being destroyed by carelessness and indifference. I had to take action, to educate others, and to be a voice for those who couldn't speak for themselves. Over the next few weeks, I became consumed with researching environmental issues, attending local activism meetings, and volunteering for cleanup efforts in the community. My one simple dream of working for a national park had evolved into a burning desire to make a real, tangible difference in the fight against pollution and climate change. Little did I know that this newfound passion would soon put me on a collision course with forces far more powerful and deeply rooted than I could have ever imagined. As the summer drew to a close and my senior year began, I found myself struggling to maintain my usual academic focus. My mind was constantly preoccupied with the environmental issues I had become so passionate about over the past few weeks. During class, I would often find myself doodling sketches of protest signs or jotting down ideas for raising awareness instead of taking notes on the lesson. It didn't take long for my parents to notice the shift in my behavior and priorities. They had always been supportive of my interests, but they grew increasingly concerned about my newfound obsession with activism, fearing it might jeopardize my college prospects. "We're proud of your passion, sweetheart," my mom said one evening over dinner. "But you can't let this consume you entirely. You need to find a balance." My dad nodded in agreement. "Your mother's right. We want you to fight for what you believe in, but not at the expense of your future." I tried to reassure them that I could handle the workload, but deep down, I knew they had a point. Still, I couldn't bring myself to let go of the cause that had become so dear to me. It was around this time that I learned about a major corporation that had been illegally dumping toxic waste into the river that flowed through our town. The news infuriated me, and I knew I had to do something about it. Against my parents' wishes, I began attending protest rallies and organizing awareness campaigns with a local environmental group. We printed flyers, staged demonstrations, and even went door to door, educating our neighbors about the company's misdeeds. At first, our efforts seemed to fall on deaf ears. The corporation was a powerful entity with deep pockets and influential connections. But we refused to back down, and slowly but surely, our voices began to grow louder. The conflict between my passion and my parents' concerns for my future came to a head one fateful night when I received a call that would change the course of everything. The call was from Jessica, one of the core members of our environmental activist group. Her voice was frantic, barely able to get the words out. "They're planning to discharge again tonight. We have to stop them," she exclaimed. "Meet us at the old waterfront warehouse in 30 minutes. I didn't need any more details. I knew exactly what she was referring to: the corporation's illegal toxic waste dumping into our beloved river. Without a second thought, I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door. "Where do you think you're going at this hour?" My dad's stern voice stopped me in my tracks. Panic gripped me as I realized I couldn't tell them the truth. They would never allow me to go. "Just out with friends," I muttered, averting my gaze. My mom stepped forward, her brow furrowed with concern. "Honey, it's a school night, and it's getting late. Can't this wait until tomorrow?" I shook my head adamantly. "No, it can't wait. This is important." With that, I rushed out the door before they could protest further, ignoring their calls for me to come back. My heart pounded in my chest as I raced toward the warehouse, adrenaline coursing through my veins. When I arrived, Jessica and a small group of fellow activists were already there, huddled around a set of blueprints and maps. They quickly briefed me on the plan. We were going to sneak onto the corporation's premises and attempt to block the discharge valves before any more toxic waste could be released into the river. I knew the risks involved, but in that moment, all I could think about was the family of ducks I had seen suffering from the pollution months earlier. I couldn't let that happen again, not on my watch. With a deep breath, I nodded my agreement, and we set off into the night, armed with nothing but our determination and a burning sense of purpose. Little did I know that this daring act of civil disobedience would have consequences that would echo far beyond the boundaries of our small town, consequences that would test my resolve, my relationships, and my very beliefs to their absolute limits. Our plan was simple in theory, but fraught with risks. We would split into two groups, one to create a distraction at the front gate, while the other snuck around to the rear loading dock where the toxic discharge valves were located. I was part of the second group, tasked with getting past the security perimeter undetected. As we crept through the shadows, my heart pounded in my chest. This was far more than a student protest. We were actively breaking the law. But in my mind, it was a necessary act of civil disobedience against a corporation that had shown blatant disregard for the environment. We made it to the loading dock without incident, but that's when everything went sideways. Apparently, the distraction team had been captured, raising immediate alarms. Suddenly, blinding security lights illuminated the area as guards began sweeping the premise. "Run!" Jessica hissed, and we took off, desperately searching for cover. I could hear shouting and barking dogs in the distance as we raced between towering stacks of shipping containers. At one point, a spotlight passed right over us, and I felt my blood turn to ice. But we pressed on, driven by sheer adrenaline. Finally, we reached a small utility shed and huddled inside, catching our breath. That's when I heard the unmistakable sound of valves opening. They were starting the discharge. Without thinking, I burst from our hiding spot and sprinted towards the valve array, ignoring Jessica's frantic whispers. Time seemed to slow as I closed in, my sole focus on shutting those valves before it was too late. That's when the first gunshot rang out. The deafening blast echoed through the loading dock as I instinctively hit the ground. More shots followed, whizzing past with terrifying proximity. "Stop! Don't move!" A guard's voice bellowed, as heavy footsteps rapidly approached. Trapped in their line of fire, I could only lie there paralyzed, my cheek pressed against the cold concrete. As the guard seized me, I caught a glimpse of Jessica's horrified expression before everything went black. When I finally came to, I was in police custody, my wrists bound by metal cuffs. The bitter truth began to set, and my acts of protest had crossed a dangerous line, and now I found myself facing criminal charges that could derail my entire future. But that was only the beginning of a long and arduous journey that would test my convictions like never before. The holding cell was cold and dimly lit, the harsh fluorescent lights only serving to deepen the pit of dread in my stomach. As I sat there, my hands still bound, I replayed the events of the night over and over in my mind. How had things spiraled so quickly out of control? The sound of the cell door clanging open shook me from my thoughts. Two stern-faced officers entered, one carrying a file folder. "You're in a whole lot of trouble, kid," the taller one stated gruffly. "Breaking and entering, trespassing, destruction of private property, those are just the start of the charges you're facing." My mouth went dry as he listed off the offenses. This was far more serious than I had anticipated. Still, I mustered what little defiance I had left. "That company was illegally dumping toxic waste. Someone had to stop them." The officer's expression remained impassive. "That's for the courts to decide, not you. You took the law into your own hands. But you have to understand dash." I started, but he cut me off with a raise of his hand. "Save it for your lawyer, because you're going to need one." With that, he turned and exited the cell, his partner following close behind. I slumped back against the wall, feeling utterly defeated. How could I have let it come to this? My actions were meant to protect the environment, but now I was facing real criminal consequences. The gravity of my situation really hit home when my parents arrived at the station hours later. The look of shock and disappointment on their faces was like a dagger to my heart. "What were you thinking?" my dad growled through gritted teeth, barely able to look me in the eye. My mom simply wept silently in the corner. I opened my mouth to explain, to justify my actions, but the words wouldn't come. How could I make them understand the passion that drove me, the need to take a stand? In that moment, I realized I had crossed a line that I could never uncross. Over the next few weeks, the conflicts only intensified. My parents, struggling with a mix of anger, concern, and confusion, alternated between intense shouting matches and tense, icy silences. The strain it put on our once close relationship was immense. Meanwhile, the media caught wind of the story, casting me alternately as a radical eco-terrorist or a noble activist unjustly persecuted. Facing a potential prison sentence, I found my convictions repeatedly tested as high-priced lawyers tried to negotiate a plea bargain. But I refused to back down, even when it became apparent that my actions had severe personal consequences. I lost several close friends who disagreed with my methods. My academic performance suffered tremendously, jeopardizing my college acceptance letters. Yet through it all, I remained resolute in my belief that I had done the right thing, even if the cost was higher than I ever could have imagined. Sometimes you have to be willing to sacrifice everything to stand up for what you believe in. Little did I know, the greatest sacrifice was yet to come, a sacrifice that would shake me to my very core and make me question every decision that had led me to this point. As my trial date approached, the pressure and conflicts only seemed to intensify. My parents had hired an expensive lawyer in a last-ditch effort to avoid the harshest penalties, but I knew deep down that I would likely be facing jail time. The prospect of being locked away terrified me, yet I couldn't bring myself to accept any plea deal that would force me to renounce my beliefs and actions. I was convinced that I had done the morally right thing in trying to stop the corporation's environmental crimes, no matter the personal cost. On the day the trial began, the courthouse was swarmed with media and protesters from both sides. As I made my way through the circus, I caught glimpses of hateful signs and chants denouncing me as a dangerous radical. But there were also supporters cheering me on as an icon for environmental justice. The trial itself was a grueling, emotionally draining experience. The prosecution painted me as a reckless eco-terrorist who put lives at risk with my stunt. They brought forward witnesses from the corporation portraying the toxic dumping as within legal limits and properly permitted. My lawyer attempted to flip the narrative, positioning me as an idealistic young activist who had no choice but to take a stand against blatant corporate greed and corruption. We presented evidence of the waterway's deteriorating condition and its impact on the local ecosystem. Through it all, my parents sat stoically in the courtroom, their faces unreadable masks. I could only imagine the turmoil and conflict they must have been enduring internally. After weeks of testimony, it was finally time for the jury to decide my fate. Those final moments before they read the verdict were utterly soul-crushing. I felt like I was suspended in limbo, my entire future hanging in the balance. On the charges of breaking and entering, trespassing with intent, and destruction of private property, we the jury find the defendant. The forewoman's words sent a hush over the courtroom. I held my breath, bracing myself for the inevitable. Not guilty. The words hit me like a ton of bricks. Not guilty? How was that possible? I stole a glance at my parents, whose expressions had turned to ones of sheer relief. But the reprieve was short-lived. However, on the charges of conspiracy to commit a crime and reckless endangerment, we find the defendant guilty. My head spun as the judge's gavel pounded, unable to process what I just heard. I had avoided the worst charges, but had still been convicted on serious counts. As I was led away in shackles, I caught my mother's eye one last time, a heartbreaking mix of sadness, love, and uncertainty. In that moment, I knew my life had been irrevocably altered. Even if I avoided jail time, I would forever be branded a criminal in the eyes of many. My youthful idealism and noble intentions had been forged in the fires of harsh reality. Yet, as difficult as this lesson was, it was only the beginning of an even more profound journey that would make me question everything I thought I knew about courage, sacrifice, and the lengths one must go to truly make a difference in this world. The judge's gavel pounded heavily, the sound echoing through the courtroom like a dull death knell. For the crimes of conspiracy and reckless endangerment, I sentence you to 5 years in a state penitentiary. The words hung in the air like a thick fog, slowly suffocating me as the reality set in. 5 years, half a decade behind bars for my actions. I barely registered the prosecutor's satisfied nod or my lawyer's crestfallen expression. All I could focus on was my mother's sobs from the gallery. In an instant, my dreams, my future, my life's purpose, all of it evaporated into the ether of sacrifice upon the altar of civil disobedience. What was meant to be a noble stand against injustice had indeed come at a profound cost, potentially the best years of my youth, spent languishing in a cold prison cell. As the guards led me away in chains, I caught one last haunting glimpse of the courthouse doors and the future that now lay in ruins before me. The magnitude of what I had sacrificed hung like a vice around my neck. Yet, even as I was processed through the brutal realities of intake and assigned my inmate number, a part of me remained resolved that I had done the right thing. If taking this unjust fall was the price for shining a light on corporate criminality, so be it. Over the long years that followed, I clung to that conviction like a life raft in the midst of a raging storm. The dehumanizing oppression of institutionalized life, the beatings, the solitary confinement, the anguish of seeing my youth ebb away, all of it chipped away at my resolve bit by bit. When I finally emerged, a shell of my former self, blinking against the harsh light of freedom after half a decade of penance, I found a world that had largely moved on without me. In my absence, the corporation's environmental crimes had been exposed by others, leading to massive fines and leadership overhauls. My actions had been a sacrificial match to a bonfire that burned with or without me. As I struggled to readjust to a life that felt so utterly foreign after my ordeal, I couldn't help wondering if it had all been worth it in the end. Yes, I had remained true to my convictions. But at what cost? The broken relationships, the life I would never get back, the profound psychological and emotional scarring. In the years that followed my release, I drifted from place to place, never able to regain my footing or rekindle the dreams of my youth. The heavy chains of remorse weighed me down like a proverbial anchor, pulling me deeper and deeper away from the light I had sought to spread.